Hello, I'm Michael Legue. Terrorism is a hot word in today's world. Though it has been a ruthless mix of mayhem and death in dozens of international incidents, terrorism has matured into a violent cancer. In the 1960s and 1970s, terrorism was a series of calculated but local political crimes. In the 1980s, terrorism has grown into low-intensity warfare. Today, thousands of nameless and highly trained killers are engaged in hundreds of carefully planned violent operations. World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam each had their individual war identity. Many believe terrorism and low-intensity warfare will be the identity of World War III. All experts agree on two things. One, Americans have long been targeted internationally. Two, the new American target is the continental United States. When international terrorist incidents occur that affect Americans or American interests, incident management is directed by the United States Department of State with military support available from the Department of Defense. When domestic terrorist incidents occur inside the United States borders, incident management is directed by the Department of Justice through the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All domestic terrorist attacks will directly involve state, county, and municipal law enforcement officers. It behooves every American to thoroughly educate himself about terrorism. For law enforcement agencies, it is indeed an extreme priority that you know more about terrorism than you are exposed to through the media. This briefing will introduce you to terrorism, focus on what terrorism is, enlighten you about the terrorist goals, perspectives, and ideologies, inform you who the terrorists are, and where they are operating as of July 1986. We shall examine how the terrorists are organized, show you some of their training, and reveal the violent actions they take to achieve their objectives. Remember the first rule: there are no rules. Let's start with some history. Terrorism has been in the world for thousands of years. In Roman Empire times, Julius Caesar took hostages to ensure the obedience of conquered tribes. The word terror actually comes from the Latin word which means fear. Terrorism as a word first came into widespread use during the French Revolution. During that reign of terror, it is estimated that more than 300,000 people were arrested and 17,000 people were executed without trial. Radical political philosophies and the use of violence as a political tool spread through Europe in the 1880s. In the early 1900s, the emphasis of political terrorism shifted to individual acts of violence, usually directed at heads of state or the members of the ruling elite. In the Communist Revolution, 1917 to 1920, Lenin used terrorism extensively to overthrow the existing government and encouraged international terrorism as a tool for change. His words were the prophecy of terrorism in the modern sense. Terrorism, in its current form, is a product of civil unrest of the late 1960s and early 1970s, when causes such as civil rights, nuclear disarmament, and the Vietnam War became a focal point for Soviet KGB psychological warfare operations. University students unknowingly were rallied to deliberate Soviet causes, though they were often simply seeking to correct what they perceived as society's wrongs. Some of these student groups spawned violent and radical factions, such as the SDS, the Weathermen, and the Black Panthers. This outburst of radical causes coincided with the access to the world through television.
The flight engineer with a gun and kicking the first man brutally with his legs and karate chops from the back and from the front. The man was very badly hurt. I do not know which man was shot. He was a Marine.
And thus the most important weapon of terrorism was born. Satellites, electronic cameras, and immediacy to audience became the terrorist targets through acts of violence. Terrorists even planned incidents with television primetime in mind. Terrorist groups over the past 20 years have executed plots of extreme violence for supposed political reasons. Often it was suggested that the violent acts were committed by lunatics who had no reason, no regard for destruction or property, no concern for the killing and maiming of innocent human beings. The truth is that almost all terrorist acts are carefully planned and violently committed by dedicated people. The Black September terrorist group, Munich, Germany, 1972. 11 Israeli athletes participating in the Olympic Games were killed. December 21st, 1975. Economic ministers from several oil-producing nations were kidnapped, held hostage, and subsequently released. On May 5, 1972, the Japan Red Army terrorist group attacked the Lod Airport in Tel Aviv, Israel. More than 30 people were killed and many more wounded. Irish Republican Army terrorist groups struck time and time again in North Ireland throughout the 1970s. There is continuing terrorist violence in that country in 1986. In May 1973, South Moroccan terrorists hijacked a passenger train in Holland. After 18 days of hostage holding, the train was stormed by government and police troops, and the incident was terminated. On 28 October 1977, Palestinian and German terrorist groups joined to hijack a Lufthansa airliner. Special commando teams from Germany recaptured the aircraft in Somalia and freed the hostages. The leader of the Christian Democratic Party was kidnapped in Rome, Italy, 16 March 1978. The Red Brigade terrorist group subsequently killed Aldo Moro, and he was found dead in a car on 9 May 1978. On 14 February 1979, the American embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, was bombed. General Alexander Haig narrowly escaped an assassination attempt on 25 June 1979. The incident occurred near SHAPE headquarters in Belgium.
There were probably two.
On 4 November 1979, the American embassy in Iran was seized by the followers of Ayatollah Khomeini. 60 Americans were taken hostage. They were held in captivity for more than a year. On 27 February 1980, the Dominican Republic Embassy in Bogota, Colombia was seized and several foreign ministers were taken hostage. They were held for 61 days by the M-19 terrorist group. Final negotiations allowed the terrorists to go free and to be transported to Cuba. One of the hostages was an American ambassador who was forced to escort the terrorists to Cuba.
They had carbines, sawed-off shotguns, sporting rifles, 45s, and grenades. They did have engines, yes.
On 6 October 1981, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt was assassinated while attending a military anniversary celebration, honoring the time when Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal to recapture part of the Sinai Desert.
Then all hell broke loose. People were screaming and yelling. Bullets were going back and forth from security men to the truck. You could see wounded people all over the place. I saw one guy in the steps of the viewing stand close to Sadat. He was obviously dead.
In December 1981, Brigadier General William Dozier of the United States Army was kidnapped in Rome, Italy. He was held as a hostage and confined to a tent in an apartment for 42 days. The 23rd of October 1983 became a historical day of tragedy for the United States. A truck carrying explosives plunged into the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. More than 200 Marines were killed in the explosion and subsequent collapse of the multi-story building.
We went through two barricades around another and ended up in the lobby of the main complex that houses the headquarters of the battalion landing team.
He has pulled a hand grenade pin and he is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must, I repeat, we must land at Beirut. We must land at Beirut. No alternative. They are beating the passengers. They are beating the passengers. They are threatening to kill them now. They are threatening to kill them now. We want the fuel now.
From mid-June 1985 to 14 July, the United States and the world watched as passengers of the Trans World Airlines Flight 847 were held hostage in Beirut, Lebanon.
So they're about to shoot a passenger. They just shot a passenger to the 847.
Because they singled out the 4 Marines and 1 American traveling on an official passport, and they brutally beaten up 2 Marines.
On 18 June 1985, while the TWA skyjacking continued, 4 U.S. Marines were killed while eating lunch at the Mediterranean Club in San Salvador, El Salvador.
We and the Salvadoran leaders will move any mountain and ford any river to find the jackals and bring them and their colleagues in terror to justice.
On 7 October 1985, the Italian cruise ship Achille Lauro was seized by terrorists as it sailed from Port Said, Egypt. American Leon Klinghoffer, a wheelchair-bound New Yorker, was shot, then shoved off the deck of the ship into the Mediterranean Sea. The Palace of Justice was seized by terrorists in Bogota, Colombia on November 6, 1985. More than 100 people were killed in an assault by Colombian army troops. Terrorists killed the Chief Justice of the Colombian Supreme Court. On 23 November 1985, an Egyptian airliner was skyjacked and forced to land in Malta. Egyptian commandos subsequently assaulted the airliner and more than 50 people were killed.
I had my head down when the bullets were fired and there was the enormous explosion of the first grenade going off.
On 27 December 1985, simultaneous attacks were made on the El Al airline ticket counters at the Rome and Vienna airports. It was a bloodbath.
It was off, but it kept going. Pop, 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 and you thought, shoot him, kill him.
Children cry, it was very, very terrible.
On 2 April 1986, TWA Flight 840, flying across the Mediterranean Sea, had a bomb explode in flight while flying at 15,000 feet. A mother, her baby, the grandmother, and another American were killed. On 5 April 1986, the La Belle nightclub in Berlin was bombed. 2 American military personnel were killed and several hundred other people were injured. This action provoked an airstrike on Libya by American Air Force and Navy aircraft.
Our determination to continue our campaign against state-sponsored terrorism is undiminished.
And terrorists continue to explode car bombs in Beirut as this briefing goes to final print. Terrorism, ruthlessly planned violence, dedicated action, a desperate and deadly struggle to stimulate fear, political disorder, and world revolution. Not lunatics, but intelligent, rational, deeply committed operatives, terrorists who believe in a cause and use violence to accomplish their goals. To them, any kind of violence is morally justified. Get rid of the idea that you will have terrorists come at you with foam coming out of their mouths and screaming insults. Terrorists will strike quickly, efficiently, very destructively, and without warning. They will leave the same way. Terrorism has always been difficult to define, and even today, there is no single definition used by all of the departments of the United States government. We define terrorism as the calculated use of violence to attain goals, often political or ideological in nature, through instilling fear, intimidation, or coercion. It involves a criminal act, sometimes symbolic, but always intended to influence the audience beyond the immediate victims. The most important phrase in this definition is to influence the audience beyond the immediate victims. You witnessed the film of terrorist events a moment ago. The 11 Israelis who died in Munich were the immediate victims of terrorism. But the true target of the operation was the 1 billion people who were watching the Olympics on television. They also saw the incident, and the Black September organization achieved great success in publicizing its view on the Palestinian refugees. to influence those beyond the immediate victims, the backbone of terrorism doctrine. These are intelligence files, newspaper articles, magazine articles, and police and law enforcement photos. I can assure you that there are terrorist actions every day. In some corner of the world, violence is committed to further a cause by centralizing attention to that cause. Violence makes headlines, gets magazine copy, finds a place on the 6 o'clock news. May I remind you that I mean some corner of the free world. Totalitarian governments have very little terrorism. Terrorism there is simply called treason, with immediate and deadly retaliation. Who are the terrorists? Some divide them into three main groups: crusaders, criminals, crazies. Crusaders like the PLO, criminals like Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army, crazy like Hinckley, who tried to assassinate President Reagan. This is an easy way to classify terrorists, but the truth is that it is a broad definition of people who tend to have overlapping elements in many areas. Often a terrorist pretends, maybe even believes, that he is with one group when he really belongs to another. In profiling terrorists, one must probe deeper than surface names that tend to be accurate but not analytic. Political extremists fill a large block in terrorist society. They are usually from upper or upper middle class families with parents that are politically active but not violently politically active. They often come from professional parents and have either a profession themselves or incomplete professional training. Usually they are single, urban, bright, and dedicated people from all walks of life, but often from such professions as medicine and law. The lower down in the ranks one looks, the wider range of personality styles one begins to see. There are the disillusioned, the mentally ill, the sociopaths who have been recruited from prisons, as Hitler did for the SS in the 1930s, the ideologically motivated, the mercenary who became a terrorist for money. All are usually led by a political extremist. Terrorism backgrounds and personality styles tend to vary from country to country. Another type of terrorist is the fleeing criminal. He may even take hostages on impulse to avoid immediate apprehension and to have a bargain chip for escape. He does not want to die. He has no cause to die for. He often does not want to kill, particularly if there has been no previous murder. The wronged person type of terrorist seeks to notify society about defects in the system or the establishment because of some disagreeable experience. He is usually seeking redress of the experience or publicity of that wrong. He, in effect, tries to take justice in his own hands. Group dynamics can complicate this situation because there may be a group of people who have suffered similar or assumed injustices, and they may create backing and support for the terrorist. The situation of the wronged person is different from the political extremist in that it is motivated by a wish for revenge. The religious fanatic type of terrorist is often a person who has been a failure in life and now looks for divine powers to bolster his self-image and self-concept. He usually sees himself as superior to others on the sole basis of his belief system, which states that if he is killed in holy cause action, he is automatically assured a place in heaven. Religious groups who believe their mission is to change everyone that does not believe their way, regardless of the methods required, create the most dangerous hostage takers. It is also of note that the leader of the religious group is almost never directly involved in the violent crime, but only gives orders. 52% of all United States terrorists and hostage takers are mentally disturbed. Of course, there are mentally disturbed people in every corner of the world. The terrorist incident may be spontaneous or planned, for many of these people have intermittent periods of lucidity in the psychosis. Often it may take an extended period of contact before craziness is revealed in the terrorist's speech. Delusions and/or hallucinations probably will not impair his ability to do what he wants to do with the situation. Terrorists are crusaders, criminals, and crazies, yes, but they are also political extremists, wronged persons, religious fanatics, and the mentally disturbed. Your survival may well be determined by correct analysis of the category which fits your situation. It will be the basis for any empathy, any conversation, and any method you employ to contain the event and end the incident. How we look at terrorism is important because for each person it is a different view. The phrase "one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter" is overused because it carries some truth. But to a law enforcement officer, all terrorists are dangerous, well-trained, and violence-oriented. Survival depends on constant vigilance. However, there are different perspectives of any terrorist incident. The perspective of the terrorist is how they see themselves. They do not look on themselves as evil. On the contrary, they see themselves as legitimate soldiers in a cause and a war of purpose. The perspective of the target government is just the opposite. All acts of violence committed by its political opponents are terrorism. But almost all incidents eventually cause the government to act in such a manner as to determine the success or failure of the terrorist objectives, which in turn define those for and those against the terrorists. And that creates another perspective, that of the people who become a media audience. Seldom is there neutrality. Most large terrorist groups know this and spend a lot of money on sophisticated public relations and propaganda campaigns to foster the Robin Hood image for themselves. Terrorist perspectives, how we look at acts of terrorism, are usually different points of view of the same event. Terrorists' objectives are what they want to achieve, their long-range goals.
In this segment of Introduction to Terrorism, we have described the threat of terrorism and presented a visual history of high-profile incidents through July 1986. We have defined terrorism and given you an insight into terrorist profiles and perspectives. In the next segment of Introduction to Terrorism, we will discuss objectives, targets, and areas of operation. We will outline the organizational structures of most terrorist groups and provide a graphic view of their training and violence.